Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you guys for joining us for our webinar series. The Duke 15Q Alliance is hosting several webinar series on Wednesdays on topics that interest our community. My name is Nih King, and I am the administrator for the Duke 15Q Alliance. And tonight we have our Governmental and Advocacy Committee members, Julia Jordanich, who also serves on the Board of Directors, and Lisa Wessel. And they are going to talk to you tonight about why your voice matters and governmental advocacy for Duke 15Q and the rare disease community. So I'm going to let you take it away, Julia.
Oh, thanks. Hi, I'm Julia Jordanich, and I'm a mom of a child with Duke 15Q. And this is an area that's especially interesting. I'm interested in because I'm an attorney, and I also worked as a legislative director for a state senator for a couple years. And so this area is near and dear to my heart, and I think there's a lot we can do here. So that's why we got this started. So hope you guys can all follow along and learn something tonight. Just to get started, our alliance has over 2,000 members total, which is fantastic. And about 600 of those are in the international community. So even though we're small, we can be mighty, as I wrote here. And being an advocate doesn't mean that you need to spend a lot of time. I titled this Governmental Advocacy for Duke 15Q and the Rare Disease Community, a guide for those who want to make a difference but have very busy lives. So yes, we all have very busy lives, but today we're just gonna give you some ideas of what we can do to advocate for the Duke 15 community. All right, so we're hoping all the things we talk about today can make a difference in the lives of our family members with Duke 15Q. We have already made a difference at the state and federal levels, so I wanted to have Lisa Wessel talk about her experiences as an advocate. Lisa, take it away.
Sure. That picture that you're looking at right now is our U.S. Senator from Maine, Senator Angus King, who was giving a speech on the Senate floor about preserving healthcare, funding for healthcare, and that is a picture of my daughter Lydia. And the way we got to that point was, it's kind of an odd story. I'll try to tell it quickly. I started out, my first activity as an advocate was when Lydia turned 5, and our school district and the state tried to tell me that she had to enroll in kindergarten. And she was an August birthday and was developmentally delayed anyway. And I thought we should delay kindergarten for a year. And what I was being told was that that was the only way she could get services, was to enroll in kindergarten. And if I were the parent of a neurotypical child, I would have had a choice of delaying kindergarten for a year. And that just seemed fundamentally unfair to me. And so I fought that. And was then informed that the only way to get her services was to apply for Medicaid so that she could get her services funded that way. And I did that, and I succeeded in that. And it was very hard and very frustrating, but it gave me the idea that if you stand up to things that don't make sense and that don't seem fair for what your child needs, that you sometimes can make a change, you can make a difference. And so I wrote on that for a while and went through, and after that, my advocacy was mostly around her IEP, getting her the services that she needed, and worked with the school department. And I didn't get very politically active after that until she started to transition out of high school. And we live in Maine. And Maine used to be a leader in services for adults with disabilities. And so I had it in my head that if I did everything I could to make sure she got the education she needed and the therapy she needed, that when she graduated from high school, that she would be sort of taken care of, that there would be services waiting for her and housing options and employment options. And what I didn't notice is that while she was going through the school system, all of those services were dying a death of 1,000 cuts. And by the time she graduated, there was very little left. And I got connected with other parents who were trying to find services for their kids, and ended up with this group of really powerful parents. And these are parents who had jobs, who had other lives, and were also taking care of their kids. And we banded together And I'm not much of a group joining person. It took me a long time even to join the Alliance, which was ridiculous because it was a very good decision that I made. But together, we've actually been able to do quite a few things. And the first political action I got involved with was when in the state, they tried to implement this thing called the SIS, which is a supports intensity scale. It was a single assessment that would determine everybody's level of services, one assessment. And this is something they're struggling with in Minnesota right now, which I'll talk about later. And this group of parents who had more experience with it than I did said, this is crazy, we have to fight this. We went to hearings at the state and we were successful in convincing the DHHS not to pass that. And then, as the work went on, it became obvious that there were things on the federal level, and healthcare being the most obvious. And the way this Senator King's speech on the Senate floor came to pass is that this group of parents, contacted Senator King's office and said, we'd like to talk to your healthcare people and talk about how everything that has to do with healthcare impacts people with disabilities to the nth degree. You can't talk about healthcare without talking about people with disabilities, and nobody was talking about it. And he happened to have a very, very receptive staff and is a very receptive senator. We met with him I think on a Friday, and within a week, this is what happened on the Senate floor. I'm not saying this is what will happen every time. Your child is not always going to end up in the Senate record, but representatives are there. Their job is to listen to you, and their job is to work for you. And it's hard to think of it that way because it can be intimidating. But if any of you have ever fought for insurance coverage, which I guarantee every one of you has, I can tell you that this is easier than fighting with an insurance company. And you've probably succeeded at that. So what I'm hoping we will be able to do today is to demystify the idea of dealing with your elected officials, because they are people, and they are people who work for you, unlike insurance companies. So I'm sure that you have it in you to do this to some extent, and we're going to talk about how that can be made pretty easy for you.
Okay, thank you. I have to agree with you that I find advocacy with my representatives and senators actually easier than dealing with my my insurance company as well. So let's get started. As far as this webinar, I'm going to begin by providing some background regarding our legislative agenda, which involves basically aligning ourselves with advocates within the rare disease community. And then I'm going to give you some suggestions on how you can advocate for the Duke 15Q community. It's like 7 suggestions. It's not that difficult. So to start, I know this is a sort of funny slide to start with about disease and syndrome and explaining that, but the first time I advocated for Duke 15Q was with Jackie Walorski in Indiana. And one of her staff members asked me immediately, well, why do you fall under the rare disease community? And I have to say, I stalled and thought it through. I wish I'd had this information in front of me. But anyway, I'm going to give this to you just because it helps me now anytime I meet with legislators. First of all, yes, Duke 15Q does fall under the definition of a disease. It doesn't have to be a scary term. It just means that people living with Duke 15Q have a condition that impairs normal functioning. That's it. And why is it called a syndrome, which you'll hear frequently in terms of our website, et cetera. All it means is that we have, and I gave you this definition, a group of signs and symptoms that occur together and characterize a particular condition. So that's all that syndrome means. Why are we aligning ourselves with rare disease advocacy groups? Well, it's because they're really well organized and they have the same goals. So that's where we're starting on this, and that's what I'm focusing on with this webinar. Okay, so then I wanted to just mention to you that a rare disease is defined as a condition that affects less than 200,000 people. Wish I'd had that definition when I met with the representative. This is the only time ever where I feel like I've been thrown a curveball, and I was like, and that definition was created by Congress in the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. rare diseases became known as orphan diseases because drug companies weren't interested in adopting them to develop treatments, and I'll get into that in just a minute. And there's about 7,000 rare diseases that are known. So that means like the total number of Americans living with rare disease is somewhere between 25 and 30 million. Okay, it's quite a few. So as I was saying before, we're trying, as Duke 15Q Alliance is trying to set up some kind of a legislative agenda that's going to help our organization. And in doing that, we are aligning ourselves with two primary advocacy groups, and that is NORD and RDLA. So NORD is National Organization for Rare Disorders, and RDLA is a Rare Disease Legislative Advocates. These are non-partisan groups. They don't align themselves with any particular political party. And so those are the two organizations we're going to focus on. With regard to NORD, I think you really should know about that one in particular. It's an incredibly excellent, well, a very good organization that was set up about 30 years ago to serve the rare disease community. It provides programs and services to people with rare disorders and their families. And it also provides information for patient organizations, medical professionals, those who want to develop new diagnostics and treatments. So what does it do? Just to give you a couple ideas here, and believe me, it's actually a lot more than this, but they have an excellent database of rare diseases that provides information about the disease. And yes, Duke 15Q is now in that database. They also maintain a patient assistance program to help get life-saving or life-sustaining medications. They provide information on clinical trials available for various rare diseases. They actually have this really cool online physician guide that is a resource for clinicians. They publish information regarding area of interest to the rare disease community. Like they have countless videos on various issues. Like one I watched recently was regarding gene therapy, and they fund grants related to rare disease research. So that's what NORD is. And in terms of advocacy, NORD works both at the state and the federal levels to influence policy that impacts the rare disease community, okay? So one really important part of NORD is what is called their Rare Action Network, also known as RAN. I hear it going as RAN all the time, and that is their advocacy network. It's incredibly helpful. It serves patients, families, caregivers, etc. It works mostly at the state level, but then it filters information up to NORD's national federal policy team to help address issues of national concern. So RAN is an excellent resource. And by the way, our board member, Mike Porath, I can never say this, is also on NORD's board of directors. So NORD is one excellent resource to advocate for the rare disease community. The next one is RDLA, the Rare Disease Legislative Advocates. It's a program of the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, and it's basically designed to support the advocacy of all rare disease patients and organizations. The way I think of RDLA, it's a little different than NORD. It's more a platform for individual organizations to promote their legislation. They do not promote any specific policy, but they provide support to all these rare disease organizations that are seeking introduction or enactment of legislation. So think of it also, it's like a free grassroots advocacy resource. They provide webinars, newsletters, legislative scorecard, etc. Okay, so I've given you the background on why we think, why we're setting up a legislative agenda that aligns ourselves with these two organizations. Now, I'm just going to give you ideas, 7 suggestions specifically, to help you to advocate for the Duke 15 community. By the way, there's no pressure. It's entirely up to you what you want to do in terms of your time frame and how much time you have to work on this. It can be as little as a few minutes a week, or you could spend more time on it. It's entirely up to you. I'm just going to give you these 7 suggestions. So we'll break it down also by way of suggestions that are more at the federal level and then suggestions that are at the state level. I enjoy doing both of those. Okay, suggestion number 1. I included the simplest suggestion to start, which is that the Duke 15Q has our alliance has an advocacy newsletter. So you can be up to speed about governmental activities that really impact us. So we're watching what's going on in terms of federal and state legislation, and then we're sending this information out in a newsletter. So if you sign up for that newsletter, you'll get those emails about that legislation and policies that impact our community. And it's up to you how you wish to respond. We'll give you ideas, but there is no required action from you. We're just asking that if you want to get involved, you could get this advocacy letter. So newsletter, sorry. So I've provided you with the website for that to sign up. So that is my first suggestion and the easiest one. Okay, on to suggestion number 2. All right, remember I was just talking about NORD and how their advocacy group is called RAN? Well, you could sign up to their calls of action, which is on their website. I gave you the website below. And if you sign up, then you're going to get emails from NORD that inform you of pending legislation and policy that is very, very important to the rare disease community. Again, it's up to you how you want to respond to these. Typically, it involves an email. They even set up the email for you sometimes. You'll see, it's just different emails with different suggestions of how to deal with it. And it's not a huge number of emails. I've noticed that. They tend to pick and choose what they feel is the most important. So that's my suggestion number 2, is to sign up with RAN on the NORD website. Okay.
I just want to point out, I followed through with one of their calls to action, and it was really easy. They put this little link there and they say, click here if you want to send an email saying that this affects your family, so on and so forth. And I clicked the button and I just had to put in my name, my state, and my email, and they did the rest of the work for me.
Which is great because you feel like you've done something.
Right.
And at the same time, it's taken very little energy and time out of your day. And we all know we're hurting in that respect. So yeah, that's a great tool. The next one, remember I was talking about the RDLA a minute ago. You could go to their website. I do it like once a week. I click on their Take Action link and check in to see what they're highlighting as legislation, both at the federal and state level, that is important to the rare disease community. And it's different than NORD. It's not, they do tend to overlap somewhat, but they also have other things that NORD hasn't necessarily taken on. So it's really easy to check it regularly. I just bookmark it and go to that link once or twice a week just to check in. So that's another thing you can do. And then again, if they have something that they've highlighted that you want to do, they're, again, going to make it very easy and tell you how to click on and send a note. So that's my 3rd suggestion. All right, the next few suggestions that I'm doing are at just the federal level. Remember, the ones I just gave you could have applied to state and federal, but now I'm just doing federal for the next few. Okay, so suggestion number 4. First of all, you're going to have to look up your 2 senators and congressional representative in case you don't have that information. So basically 3 people. And I gave you a link right here, how you can get their names and their contact information. Then you go to the RDLA website and look at their legislative scorecard. This is a fantastic tool. I've done this. For those of you that are shy and feel a little uncomfortable, all this involves basically is either you emailing or even contacting their offices specifically to talk about this scorecard. So basically it's a 3-step process where you identify these 3 people, then you go to the website, look up their legislative scorecard, and then you contact them via email or phone, whatever you're comfortable with. You could even set up a meeting, which I've done, which is, of course, because I love to talk to senators and reps. Not always, but for the most part, I feel Lisa's philosophy about really getting involved and not being afraid of these people and definitely sticking your neck out there is better. I feel like I've done something. So anyway, and then what I did is I pulled up for you, just to give you an example, my senator's scorecard from RDLA. This is Senator Todd Young's scorecard from Indiana, which is where I live. And you see those little X's on the right, that shows they're not a co-sponsor of something. The checks show that they are co-sponsors, which is a good thing. And these are the issues that RDLA is saying, okay, these are important for the rare disease community. You can look at this and you'll see there's stuff that you don't necessarily feel like you have time or the energy to advocate for. For example, the Deferment for Active Cancer Treatment Act, the Childhood Cancer Act, all of these, lymphedema treatment. Yeah, you do want to pick and choose what you want to focus on. So, and there's nothing wrong with looking at that list and thinking, okay, what's most important to do 15Q, which is what I did. And then I have set up an appointment with Senator Young's office. Here's my plan of action. First of all, and go to the next slide on this one, Nika. The first thing I'm gonna do is talk to him about having a child. Oh, okay, back up, sorry. Now, go back. I guess I don't have a slide on this. All right, go back to this. All right, sorry. What I'm gonna do on this is, first of all, I'm gonna talk about my child with Duke 15Q. I'm gonna bring in pictures of her. I am gonna talk about her diagnosis, okay? Because they need to see that. I used to be on the other end of this when I worked for the senator, and individuals would come to advocate their causes with me when I was meeting with them and the senator. And from being on that side of it, I can tell you the more personal you are, the better. You remember stories much more when you could put a name to the face, you know, a face to the name. You can see what their personal stories are. It humanizes it. So that part of it is so critical. So you can talk about your child with Duke 15Q. Here's what I raised. The first thing I talked about was the Rare Disease Caucus issue, that he is not a member. That is my plan. I'm going to discuss that right away, and I'll discuss that in just a second. I'm just going to summarize for you the stuff I'm going to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about the Medical Nutrition Act. Then what else am I going to talk about? I think those are the two. Oh, and I'm going to talk about the Orphan Drug Act, which is Open Act HR 1224. Okay, so let's go through those really quickly. I don't think I have slides on the Orphan Drug Act, so I'm going to just talk about them. Yeah, by the way, don't do that. Don't get mad. Don't raise your voice. You know, you have to be sweet and kind and thoughtful without seeming like that you're upset or angry. Anger will not get you anywhere. Okay, so let's talk about the Rare Disease Caucus. Oh, I do have a slide. Okay, so who leads it? The Representatives Butterfield and Bilirakis, I think that's how it are the ones that lead it. And then the senators that lead it are Senator Wicker and Klobuchar. And this caucus is bipartisan, bicameral. The caucus is, just in case you don't know what a caucus is, it's a group of members of the US Congress that meet to pursue common legislative objectives. And there are hundreds of caucuses, by the way. The mission of this specific caucus, and the reason why it's so important to us, and for us to ask our representatives and senators to be on this caucus, is because it provides a forum for the members of Congress to basically voice constituent concerns, collaborate on ideas, facilitate conversations between the medical and patient community, and build support for legislation that will improve the lives of people with rare diseases. So it is so important. So basically, this caucus gives a voice to the rare disease community on Capitol Hill. And so since it's bipartisan and bicameral, in other words, it's both in the House and the Senate, there's really no good argument about why they aren't on it, other than their time. So if they aren't on it, you should be asking them, why are you not on it? So that would be the first thing. And again, that's on the scorecard. You can look it up and see, based on their RDLA scorecard, whether or not they are on it. Okay, another thing the scorecard from the RDLA scorecard is going to highlight is the Orphan Drug Act. And something that you should definitely raise with your senators and representatives. The strengthening of this drug development process has always been a huge priority for both NORD and RDLA. Let me give you some background. I won't bore you with a ton of detail here, but it's important so that you understand what this Orphan Drug Act is, because as far as the rare disease community advocacy group, I should say, is concerned, this is so critical. What happened is back in 1962, there was this amendment called the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to require all drugs to undergo significant scientific studies. And that's a good thing, right? It improved drug safety, but it also, what happened is it increased the costs of development of new medications. So then pharmaceutical companies began to focus on developing treatments for common diseases. So they could recoup their, get back their research and development costs. Because of this, rare diseases were ignored and said to be quote unquote orphaned. That's why, if you've heard that term Orphan Drug Act or why meds are considered orphan, that's why. Because there was a gap between the drugs for common diseases versus rare diseases. So at that point, there were very few or no treatments available for rare disease conditions. And that's what led to the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. It was passed in the Congress to facilitate development of orphan drugs. This designation does not mean the drug is yet safe and effective. That's up to the FDA to determine. But instead, the designation, and the reason why it's so important, is that it gives companies that qualify, then they get benefits from the federal government, like market exclusivity, I cannot say that, and reduced taxes. So it's really, really important. It's been incredibly effective. Over 450 orphan therapies have been developed by the private industries since it was enacted. And prior to that, there were only 10 therapies prior to 1983. I had a thing here, it says 2013, 1/3 of all drugs approved by the FDA were orphan therapies. So this is one of the few, if not only, tax credits that saves lives, but it is always in danger of being repealed. So that's what, I just wanted to give a little bit of information to you so that you realize when you email or talk with their office, pursuant to their report card, you should ask them to support any changes or to support the Orphan Drug Act, to not let anything happen to it, and to also support any legislation that strengthens it. By the way, this specific status is incredibly important to the Duke 15 community. If you talk to them, you should mention the fact that Ovid Therapeutics was just granted orphan status for that medication that is now part of the drug trial for our children with seizures. So you can see it directly impacts us. And I will say that there has been some discussion within the current administration about repealing this tax credit. So it is definitely a concern. Okay, so that's my spiel on the Orphan Drug Act.
Just to make sure I understand this. So
Sure.
If I go to the senator's scorecard and I see that they are not part of the caucus, I ask them to be. And
Correct.
Then if I see that they're also not supporting the Orphan Drug Act, I ask them to support it, because this would encourage pharmaceutical companies to create drugs that could support Duke-15q syndrome, whether it's epilepsies or any other therapeutic drug, correct?
Correct. And on the scorecard for Senator Young, the reason I got started on that was it was shown that he was not a co-sponsor of the Open Act, and I won't get into that, but the Open Act was actually strengthening the Orphan Drug Act, and he didn't co-sponsor it. So you don't have to get into specifics about which bill is doing what for the Orphan Drug Act. You can keep it very simple by saying, please support the Orphan Drug Act. Do whatever you can to keep this tax credit in place and to strengthen it.
Because otherwise the drug companies, they're not going to want to put the time, effort, and money into creating drugs for such a small group, right?
That's right.
And I just want to echo something that Julia said earlier, that when you talk to your senators or your representatives, you can give them, if you talk to them in person, which really is the best thing, and is actually less intimidating than talking on the phone. Surprisingly, it's when you're sitting across from them, they actually look like human beings and it becomes less scary. They don't necessarily need all of the data and all of the statistics. If you want to give it to them, you can say, I'll forward this stuff to your office. What they really need is for you to tell them what your struggle is like with your child. If you have a child whose seizures are not being treated by the medications that are available now, just tell them that story.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I mean, like I said, when I used to meet with constituents, with the senator, I remember those stories. I remember those stories how many years later, because it meant something. It humanizes it. It's so important. You do not need to be an expert on the pending legislation. They are the experts. They have committees that are experts on it. You don't need to be. You just need to tell them your story. I couldn't agree more. Okay, should I keep going? One other issue that was on the scorecard that you could mention is the Medical Nutrition Equity Act of 2019. I just looked up the status on this. I still think it's not even out of committee yet. What this does is it makes access to healthcare affordable because it provides public and private insurance coverage for medically necessary foods like vitamins, and that's for digestive and inherited metabolic disorders. This is a big item for NORD and RDLA. It's really high on their list of priorities. So what they're asking for and what we agree with is that we ask House members to co-sponsor and support the bill and get it through the House. And then once it gets to the House, we want to ask the Senate members to pass it as well. This is especially helpful when you think about it, like a bunch of our kids are on keto for seizures, the keto diet. Well, then you also always have to be thinking about supplements, not just for keto, by the way, but it came up for us when we were doing it. But also, my daughter, for example, I don't know what's up, but she cannot seem to keep vitamin D and iron levels at a sufficient level. So we are always dealing with the supplements, and those are costly. So that could be covered. Right now, my insurance company actually is not covering it. I'm paying out of pocket. So that would be really helpful to have that. The inherited metabolic disorders aren't necessarily a part of Duke 15Q, but digestive disorders are definitely, we have a bunch of issues with that. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there too, that is a great thing to talk about with your senator or rep. You guys have any questions on that one? We're good? Okay, suggestion number 5. So I just talked all about how you look at their scorecard and you pick and choose from there on that scorecard of what you want to talk about. So in that case, we talked about the Rare Caucus, I talked about the Medical Nutrition Act, and I also talked about the Orphan Drug Act, okay? Because all those issues were on their scorecard for RDLA. But you could go even one step further and go to NORD's list of policy priorities. So again, it's a little different than RDLA, and I gave you the link here. And if you go on that link, you'll see that NORD has 3 very broad categories of areas that might be really, 1 or 2 might be of specific interest to you. And what you could do when you call that senator or rep or email them is you could raise those issues as well. So I gave you, in the next slide, those 3 broad categories. What they say they are, and oops, I don't know why I have 1 on each, but okay. The first one is policy advancing basic and translational research. So this is research that builds on basic scientific research to create new therapies, medical procedures, etc. The second broad category for NORD is policy ensuring access to affordable treatment. And the third broad category is policy strengthening the drug development process. Under those categories, you will see numerous things, policies that are coming up in that area. So I looked at that list, and the things that stuck out to me, and which then I decided, hey, I'm going to talk to my senator about, or my rep are the following. My pick for the first one with the translational research was increasing NIH funding. That's the National Institute of Health. And the reason I picked that one, just so you have it, is to conduct, or what the NIH does, it conducts or funds much of the essential, basic, and translational research on rare diseases. So this lays the groundwork for therapeutic development for neglected diseases with inadequate or no treatment, okay? So we need to fund NIH. And what's interesting is despite the clear health and economic importance of NIH, the funding has remained really stagnant in the last 10 years. Just so you know, just to give you an idea, what NORD is arguing is that Congress has to allow NIH funding to keep pace with inflation in each budget cycle. And for 2020, it was 41.1 billion, okay? That funding needs to keep going. For our rare disease community, that is a huge thing. So that is definitely something I'm raising with the senator. All right, under the policy ensuring access to affordable treatment. There's a bill now that's going around that's gotten a lot of attention. It's the Newborn Screening Saves Lives. And that is really important because newborn screening, I know personally it would have been incredibly helpful for us because when Natalie was born, she was having seizures and she was in NICU for a month and they didn't do any genetic testing. That would have been something that would have been incredibly helpful. We ended up finding out a lot later. So my first pick would be newborn screening, to raise that bill and say, please support it. By the way, I know that it's called HR 2507. It just got out of the House and now it's in the Senate. So it's very good news. Okay, the next thing I would definitely raise is the pre-existing conditions issue. Right now, there is a pending lawsuit called Texas v. United States. What is happening is there are about 20 states that are challenging the constitutionality of the individual mandate section of the Affordable Care Act. It just went before the Fifth Circuit and it is pending. But the reason it is important is that if the Fifth Circuit determines that it is unconstitutional, then it will basically kill the Affordable Care Act. And it doesn't matter where you're, in terms of a political thing, I don't want to get into that at all. All I want you to know is if that happens, the real concern out there is what happens to pre-existing conditions. NORD has expressed this to me repeatedly, that the issue is that if the Affordable Care Act is hurt and overturned, then what happens to these pre-existing condition clauses? And for our community, I can't think of anything more worrisome because we all know Duke 15Q is very much a pre-existing condition. So that is something you would want to raise with your senator or rep. It is a topic I have brought up repeatedly. I can't stop talking about it. I'm watching this case, but regardless of what happens to this case, you need to raise this with the legislators that represent you. And the last thing I was going to talk about was off-label use. I have raised that again and again. So the approval of over 450 orphan drugs, it's a huge step in the right direction, no question, under the Orphan Drug Act. But these drugs are indicated for only about 350 rare diseases. So that leaves thousands of rare diseases without FDA-approved treatment. And in other words, providers must treat over 95% of rare disease patients off-label. And if that's the case, they're using other drugs and methods to provide some level of care. So you want insurance to cover off-label use. So again, that is something I have raised. And then under the third category, under strengthening drug development process, well, the Orphan Drug Act is huge, but we've already talked about that. And then I would raise FDA funding. So those are my picks under those three areas.
I'm going to add one.
Okay, add one, by all means.
That is any effort to cut Medicaid funding.
Yes.
Because private insurance, at least as long as the ACA exists, is going to cover your kids only until the age of 26. If the ACA is knocked down, then you lose that at 21. And Medicaid is the only insurance for adults with disabilities. That's it. There's Medicare also, so sometimes you can get a combination of both. But we have an enormous deficit in the federal budget, and I have only like a minimal understanding of how federal budgets work, but I do know that when there's an enormous deficit, then what they try to do is to cut funding. And one of the first things they started talking about was cutting Medicaid funding. And people think of it as a state entitlement, and it's implemented by the states, and it does include some state funding, but it is largely funded federally. And if that is cut, then there is nothing for our kids. And it's not even, for those of you who have children instead of adults with disabilities, if your kids are still young, this might not be that clear yet. It doesn't become clear until your kids get older, but Medicaid supports not only healthcare funding, but it supports job supports. My daughter has a job working in a nursing home. That picture that Senator King showed was my daughter working at a nursing home. She has an actual job, but she has job supports, and the job supports are funded through Medicaid. Her transportation to any Medicaid funded service, to a doctor's appointment, to her day programs, which are funded by Medicaid, to job supports. Transportation is funded through Medicaid. And if you live in a rural state like Maine, where there is zero public transportation, that's everything. She would be a prisoner in our house if she did not have funding for transportation. So cutting Medicaid, they say that, they'll cut it, that they don't want to cut it for people with disabilities. But the truth is that there is one pot of money, and if they cut it, that does get cut. And so that's something that anytime somebody mentions cutting Medicaid, your temperature should go up, because that would be enormously dangerous for our kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical, two things have come up with this with Medicaid recently. First of all, my daughter knocked her tooth out, and the surgery, because she requires sedation, is astronomical. Medicaid is going to fund that as part of our waiver. So that's amazing. But if we didn't have that, it's $5,000. Right? And then the second issue is, well, Medicaid funding is always an issue, obviously, but that they also cover, I was just told, I don't know if this is true, but we were just told by our center that they're going to cover any ABA that is not covered by our insurance. So again, all really helpful. And you're right, it is just one pot of money. All right, so we'll add your pick to that for sure. All right, so in terms of, if you want to look at information on bills and what's going on, my go-to website is right here, the www.congress.gov. Make sure you know which Congress you are dealing with when researching a bill. I've made this mistake before. Are you looking up a bill from the 115th or the 116th session? So you'll know that by looking it up. But another thing, a great resource is everylifeorganization.org. That's where RDLA comes from. They have fact sheets about bills all the time. You can get that information from there. Also, you can simply Google a bill, because there are so many organizations that provide information about bills they support. So there's no shortage of information if you need it. All right, so now I'm going on to my suggestion number 6. Big deal here. It's actually only applies in the summer, really. If you sign up with RDLA's Rare Across America group, then you meet, they set it up for you to meet with members of Congress in their district offices each summer. And you don't have to meet alone, by the way. A lot of times when I did it in the past, they set it up so that there's multiple people there. You don't need any prior experience. The reason you should do it is really Congress should hear from you face to face. And plus you're making an impact on federal policy. You're sharing your story about living with Duke 15Q. Why do it through RDLA? Well, I will tell you, because they give you all sorts of great fact sheets of things you can talk about and talking points, which is really helpful. And they set up the meeting for you. You don't even have to set it up. They tell you when the meeting is, and you just walk in. All you have to do is show up. And when is it? Well, there's a section on the registration form that will let you know the dates. Basically, you can identify for RDLA what dates work for you. So I love that part of it. It's usually between the end of July and early September that you go to meet with your legislators. The only issue, sometimes it might require a bit of a drive, depends how far you are from the Capitol, which is typically at the state Capitol. I have to drive down to Indy, which is about 3 hours. But, well, it depends how fast I'm driving. But anyway, that's my suggestion number 6, is to sign up for RARE across America so that you can do that. And again, they set up everything for you, the meetings, etc. Okay, now I'm going to move on to advocacy at the state level. Again, with suggestion number 7, and this is my last suggestion, you go to the state level. First of all, you find out your state senator and state rep. There's a great resource that I set up so you can know who they are. I wouldn't necessarily assume you know all of them at the state level. Then you go to the NORD website to review your state's report card. And I gave you the link for that. A little different than the legislative report card that I provided to you earlier. And again, then you contact these individuals by phone, or you set up a meeting. I gave you a report card for my state that I got from this website, which I think is the next slide. There we go. Look at that. Okay, so what I would suggest on these is pick your battles. Look at where your state is. I focused on the C, Ds, and Fs. When they're A's, I'm happy, obviously. C's, not so much. So I would raise those issues where they got a C, D, or F. Let's just quickly go through this list. Medical nutrition, that's, remember I just talked about the medical nutrition bill at the federal level? Well, there are also medical nutrition bills at the state level. So you want to compel medical nutrition in commercial health plans, and there are state bills to do that. So you should ask your state senator whether or not there is such a bill right now, and if so, to push for it to be covered under your insurance companies. In other words, to compel insurance companies to cover medical nutrition. So that's one of the first things. Out-of-pocket protections, look at that. Indiana got an F. Your state report card is going to tell you whether your state has a policy to protect consumers from high out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs. And many states don't have these protections in place. And so you can ask your state senator or rep, why don't you have this in place? And you know what else you can do? You could ask them to file a bill to do that. They can do that. Not only would they file it, but you can ask them to sponsor it. Okay, remember how I mentioned newborn screening bill at the federal level? Well, states can also have that. So I guess Indiana has one of those. Then there's the individual insurance protections. Your state report card will tell you whether your state has a law prohibiting insurers from denying pre-existing conditions coverage. So you could also find out if your state has a reinsurance waiver to keep insurance affordable for people with pre-existing conditions. Again, all good things. And look at that, Indiana has an F. So I would definitely raise that. I plan to. Medicaid eligibility is what it is. I mean, if you want to talk on that, Lisa. Lisa, do you want me to get into Medicaid 1115 waivers? We have an F on that in Indiana. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, and I'll jump in if necessary.
Okay. So these are a little complicated. I did some research on it. As a way to control healthcare costs and improve services for Medicaid beneficiaries, states seek these, let's call it 1115 waivers, or I don't know if it's 1115 waivers, which allow them to make substantial changes to Medicaid benefits and eligibility. So how it works is that these waivers set it up so that the federal government can approve state-administered projects that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the CMS, then determines to be of benefit to the objectives of the Medicaid program. All right, so these projects then waive certain Medicaid requirements, allow a state to direct Medicaid funds in ways that wouldn't normally be allowed. There is certainly a need, my understanding it from NORD and RDLA is there's certainly a need to consider, creative ways and solutions to improve healthcare quality and access. But the concern is that many of the current state proposals have a detrimental effect on the rare disease community because they impact Medicaid benefits and eligibility in a way that either undermines the purpose of the program or it's disproportionately affecting people with rare diseases.
One of the ways that they do that is to have their Medicaid program funded by a block grant, which in the state of Tennessee, they are now, Tennessee was one of the last states in the country to have a waiver program at all for people with disabilities. That hasn't even been, their waiver program hasn't even been applied yet, hasn't even been approved.
Approved by the federal government.
Haven't been federally approved, and they're already starting to talk about a block grant. And if you ever hear those two words mentioned in your state, that's another thing that should get you really concerned, because the way block grants work is that they determine the level of funding necessary for your state based on who they have now, Medicaid funding. And then it goes up incrementally by cost of living or by inflation. And the problem is that if you have, it doesn't allow any flexibility for the state to respond to any kind of a crisis. If a major employer closes its doors and then you have 1,000 people who don't have health insurance anymore who might have to apply for Medicaid. If you have any kind of a natural disaster and you have that, or if you just have people who's, if you have an aging state, Maine, you would think it's Florida, but Maine has the oldest population percentage-wise in the country. And Medicaid is a lot of older people depend on Medicaid. So so our state is depending on Medicaid proportionally more than other states. So a block grant would be a disaster. It's always sold as a way to get a handle on Medicaid spending. It's really intended to cut Medicaid spending. And like Julia said, for kids like ours, it's always worse. Things that hit the healthcare community hit people with disabilities harder, and they hit our kids even harder because of its rare disease status, and because it's so it's kind of difficult to treat the conditions that our kids have. Our epilepsy condition is harder to treat. And so it requires more testing. It requires different medications. It requires a lot more spending. Our kids cost more money. That's all there is to it. And
yes, they do.
Cost more money. And so a block grant that limits that would affect our kids. And it's not, they talk about it as, incremental losses. We can't take one of our kids' medications away. You can't say, okay, we're only going to give you half of your seizure medications this week. And your legislators need to understand that they need to hear the personal stories of why any restriction on Medicaid would be detrimental to your family. And it's so that they don't think of it as dollars. They think of it as, your child. Right. That's what they need to picture. Every time they think about it, you want them to picture your child's face. That would be a win.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think the block grant falls under what NORD has indicated a concern or expressed an interest in commercial style formulary restrictions, or is that something separate? I think it is.
I don't know if it's the same thing.
I don't either, because what NORD has said in terms of that is that they said many states have proposed commercial style formulary restrictions in Medicaid programs that then limit coverage for new therapies approved by the FDA. And that is another issue. I think that's a separate issue.
I think that's managed care.
Yeah.
Managed care is another thing that some Medicaid programs operate under managed care. And I am now 2/3 of the way through reading a really dense white paper on this, which I only partially understand.
In your spare time.
In my spare time. Oh God, it's what I read before I go to sleep, because it absolutely puts me to sleep. But that's also another tool that is used to cut spending. If anyone's ever worked under an HMO for private insurance, that's what it is. It's like running Medicaid as an HMO.
Yeah, I think that's what they meant by it. And they were saying that these restrictions then cut access to vital orphan therapies. That's one of the bigger issues.
Yeah, it's much harder to get the care you need unless, yeah, it is. It just makes it harder to get the care you need.
Well, and one last issue under Medicaid 1115 waivers is that many states are proposing to add work requirements to their Medicaid programs with a handful of exemptions. So this is worrisome because NORD is concerned, and so are we, that these exemptions won't adequately address the complex health challenges facing rare disease patients. So that the work requirements can get things to be complicated. Let's hope the exemptions, we would fall under those exemptions, but we're just not sure we would. So again, those are issues to raise with 1115 waivers. Fun stuff, Medicaid law. There are lawyers, I'll tell you, who just work specifically in Medicaid and Medicare law. So I have been in a little bit busy with this stuff. The other issue is the Hcbs waivers, which is the home and community-based service waivers. A little background on this, just so everybody, I want to make sure everybody understands these, is that these waivers give states the option to receive a waiver of Medicaid, and that it basically enables states to remove income requirements for certain Medicaid services for the disabled. And many states have obtained this waiver to provide Hcbs services to disabled populations. It's great in that respect, such as intellectually disabled, age disabled, etc. And these services generally consist of, multiple things: assistance with skill development, respite, transportation, all the things you were talking about for Medicaid. The concerns we have are that which population has your state targeted for this particular waiver. In Indiana, my understanding, the reason why we have a C is it doesn't cover adults with a physical disability. So anyway, it's complicated, it's state-based, but anyway, it's out there, and a concern, and something that you can raise with your state and your state senator and your state rep. Okay, so one other thing I was going to talk about is Rare Disease Advisory Council. It'd be great if your state would have that. That's another thing you guys can talk about. But anyway, your state report card will tell you about that. That sums it up. My lovely 7 suggestions for advocating for Duke 15Q. I gave you a little fun quote. The opposite of bravery is not cowardice, but conformity. Just saying that you can make a difference. You can go out there, you can meet with those senators and reps at the state and federal levels. You can establish relationships with them, and it really doesn't have to be something that is a ton of time. It really doesn't. It really could be a few minutes a week where you're contacting them about concerns, or you can step it up and meet with them. It's entirely up to you.
Can you talk about the Duke 15Q Alliance Advocacy Committee and what your mission is? Because I know as someone who isn't as actively involved as you guys, one of my big questions would be the state report card, because now I want to look at my state's report card and see what it means, but I don't necessarily know, what the grades mean or what each individual spot represents. So even if they did get an F, I wouldn't know what to talk about. Is that something that the committee could?
We can certainly help you with that. If that is something where you're saying, why are we getting an F or a D? I can help you. Email me and we can provide that email address, right? And we can help you with that because it is state specific. It's probably going to require a little legwork where I call NORD, or I can just Google it and figure out why is Indiana, what is Indiana being, why do we have a low report card on this specific issue?
They might be able to send you their criteria, like how they right. rank the state.
I'm sure they could. Right. But sometimes, it's usually in the things I Google, it's amazing, everything comes up pretty quick. But if that is something that you're concerned about, we can certainly help you to find out why your state got a low grade on a specific area. So.
And then the mission statement of the the committee itself.
Okay, do you have it in front of you, Nika?
I do. Well,
why don't you read it out loud and then I'll go from there.
So the Duke 15Q Alliance Governmental Advocacy Committee seeks to provide information to the Alliance members with regard to important regulatory and legislative issues, both at the state and federal levels. It further seeks to educate members on how they may advocate for positive change. The committee shall identify, consider, develop Alliance positions, long-term policy issues, and serve as a resource for legislators and their aides. This is a nonpartisan committee that does not endorse any political or candidate or party.
Yeah, we can't emphasize that enough. That is absolutely true. I think that mission statement is really helpful. And also that we hope to serve as a point for legislators when they have questions about rare diseases. We want to be out there so that as a committee to answer any questions they have and about our legislative goals, which, by the way, are pretty much piggybacking NORD and RDLA.
I would say not even just rare diseases. I would say because the truth is anything that affects the disability community affects our kids more, but right. I think it would be terrific if we could be a resource for the disability community in general, for anything, you know, healthcare, housing, education. There's so many things that that affect our community more than they affect the general population. And that was the main reason that we went to meet with Senator King's staff, because he's a really strong advocate for affordable housing, for education, for all of these things that he doesn't think about with, you know, he doesn't see it through the lens of people with disabilities. And unfortunately, it's an invisible population. And so our goal in meeting with him was to just try to give it voice and to try to convince him that every time he thinks about these topics and every time he talks about them, we're still working on the every time he talks about them, but I know he thinks about them, but that he needs to consider, how does this affect people with disabilities? And so I think it would be terrific if we could be a resource for that in general and not just the rare disease community.
Yeah, I agree. I do. I think that a broader scope like that is excellent. By the way, I forgot to put in a plug. I know I gave my 7 suggestions, but RDLA has a Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill, which is an excellent resource for people that aren't super comfortable with advocating yet. They educate you. They have conferences on how to do it, and then they set up the meetings to meet with your people. So if you're anywhere near DC and want to do that, it's at the end of February. I think it's the 25th of the 28th of 2020. So I had to throw that in there.
Well, thank you ladies so much for coming on and teaching us a little bit about the governmental advocacy. There's so much to learn. Sometimes I still get a little confused, but I really appreciate the report cards and breaking down some of those bigger policies that really affect our kids. I want to point out this is a pre-recorded webinar, so if anybody has any questions, please post them below and someone will come back and answer them for you. Also, if you have any ideas or any suggestions on what you would like the committee to bring to our members, whether it's via email or discussing some major legislation and breaking it down a little bit more for you, just comment below or email believe@duke15q.org. I will also post that email in the comment section.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.